I do have a bill introduction. It's RS 046, and it's on behalf of the Kansas District Judges Association, and it's a bill that concerns law libraries and use of law library fees.
Thank you, and the bill will be so introduced. Do we have any other bill requests for bill introductions from committee members? How about anyone from the audience? Yes, go ahead. Please introduce yourself and welcome to committee.
All right, thank you, Chairwoman Warren and members of the committee. My name is Garrett Henson, and I'm with the Office of the Kansas Attorney General, and I am requesting that 2025 RS 0493, an act concerning habeas corpus and second and successive motions, be introduced.
Thank you. The bill will be so introduced.
All right, thank you.
Anyone else? Yes, come on up. Please introduce yourself and welcome to committee.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Committee. I'm Claudia Hassong with Kansas Farm Bureau, requesting introduction of 25 RS 0145, requiring an electric public utility to pay a landowner's attorney's fees when the court orders an amount greater than the appraiser's.
Thank you. The bill will be so introduced.
Thank you.
Do we have other requests for bill introductions? Yes, please introduce yourself and welcome to committee.
Good morning, Madam Chair and committee members. Eric Stafford with the Kansas Chamber of Commerce, requesting the bill introduction for 25 RS 0398. It is a requirement for disclosure of third-party litigation funders.
Thank you. The bill will be so introduced.
Thank you.
Any other requests for bill introductions? Not seeing any, then our next order of business is an update from the judicial branch, and we are going to be hearing about the Rural Justice Initiative, and welcome Justice KJ Wall from our Kansas Supreme Court, and want to also welcome our Madam Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Justice Lukert is here as well. So I don't know if she'll be available for questions later, but she's shaking her head yes. So thank you for being here, and some of her staff from her office as well. So appreciate y'all coming over from across the street, and look forward to hearing about the Real Justice Initiative. So with that, Mr. Justice, please introduce yourself and welcome to committee.
Thank you, Madam Chair and fellow committee members. My name is KJ Wall, and I am an individual that grew up in Kansas, born and raised out in Scott City, Kansas. I am a member of the Kansas Supreme Court, and I had the great fortune to chair the Rural Justice Initiative Committee. So we really appreciate the opportunity to present to you today on our findings and recommendations, and of course we'll entertain any questions that the committee members have. I believe that I have a presentation that has been delivered and can be popped up on the screen. Just to give you a little bit of a roadmap, today I hope to share a little bit of background about the origin of the Rural Justice Committee, explain the work that the committee performed, the findings and data that it was able to obtain through that work, and then finally the recommendations that the committee has made to try and address the attorney shortage in our state, particularly in rural areas of our state. So with that in mind, thank you. Just by way of background, the Rural Justice Initiative Committee began in December of 2022. It was created by an administrative order of the Chief Justice Marla Lukert, and that's sort of how we got formally started. But sort of the background story is that all of us on the court continued to hear with increasing frequency from our judges in rural parts of the state and from attorneys who had practiced law all across rural Kansas that there was a problem. The chief judges in particular were describing the difficulties that they were having finding attorneys to accept appointments in cases where the right to counsel was guaranteed either by Constitution or statute. At the same time, we had rural attorneys who had very successful firms for decades that were ready, past ready to retire, looking for somebody to come in and take over a successful practice. Mind you, they had long abandoned the idea of selling that practice. They just wanted somebody to come in and take over a very successful practice, and we're struggling to even find that. So we knew we had an issue, right? But we didn't know how to quantify it. We didn't know why it was happening to the extent it was and what to do about it. And so that was really the task of our committee. Okay. The Chief Justice was, I think, very intentional when it came to the design of this committee. We wanted to have, you know, a variety of folks that had an interest in this issue beyond just those that practice in the legal profession. Of course, we knew that we had to start with our judges that are in our rural parts of our state because they understand how the attorney shortage is impacting the administration of justice day in and day out. So you can see that we have several judges, all the way from chief judges, district court judges, and district magistrate judges that were part of our committee. Beyond that, of course, we also knew the issue would require collaboration with all branches of government. And so you can see we had members from both houses. Senator Bowers, of course, good to see you again today, was a very active and committed participant in our committee. At the time, Representative Blue as well was a member of our committee, now Senator Blue. And then we also brought in a representative from the Office of Rural Prosperity and the Department of Commerce because we thought that executive agency might have some experience and history dealing with rural businesses in particular. And last, well, not last, I should say, of course, we also wanted to see the perspective of our law schools. We have 2 law schools in the state of Kansas, Washburn University and the University of Kansas School of Law. We had representatives from both of those law schools. We also wanted an undergraduate perspective as well, particularly one that has law training programs as an undergraduate option. So we included Wendy Rolander-Sook as well on our committee to get the perspective of educators. Community leaders also. We needed to extend our perspectives beyond just legal ones. So we wanted leading representatives from leading organizations that understood the economic landscape of rural Kansas and had demonstrated an interest and commitment in our rural communities. So that's how we get folks like representatives from the Kansas Chamber, Kansas Farm Bureau, and others that you see listed there. And I jumped ahead when I said last, but certainly not least, we needed rural attorneys, right? Those that both had been practicing for decades, that had been telling us about this issue, this emerging issue that had increased with frequency and duration, obviously, over time, but also newer attorneys who had decided to not take offers from urban law firms, but to go back home and practice, or even attorneys that did practice in a big Kansas City or Wichita law firm, but then needed a change in lifestyle and decided to change and go back to urban practice. So we had several of those individuals represented as well. So, one of the first things, and before I start talking about the work that the committee performed and the findings that it made, one of the first threshold questions that we crossed is, what is rural? What are we talking about here? And we were a little bit surprised to see how many definitions there were. There's a lot of controversy, frontier, rural, et cetera. But nobody on the committee wanted to get hung up with that, especially because the legislature has already used and identified a definition that we think worked really well. So we adopted the legislator's definition that it has used in similar circumstances and defined rural just to exclude the big 5 counties, the most populous counties in our state. So that's what we mean when we're talking about rural, and there's legislative programs that are specifically targeted to promote licensed professionals to practice in rural settings that use that same definition in our state. And that definition, we thought, really did reflect the rural character of our state. And the bottom line is, we certainly understand now that by lumping counties like Riley County, Leavenworth County, Saline County, with others like Lane, Ness, Scott counties, they're not similarly situated in many respects, but they do all share the same problem, that they are struggling to recruit and retain licensed attorneys in their areas. So we thought that definition worked well. All right, so what did this committee do? This was a very hardworking committee, and I think, again, it goes back to the design and the Chief Justice identifying folks that would be really invested in this issue. And we did a lot of things. We started with the data that already existed. Obviously, we looked at census data, existing demographic data, attorney admissions information that we already had. That helped us identify some of the scope of the problem, but the real benefit of doing that is we identified where we had gaps in information, where we needed more data, so to speak. Once we did that, we were able to design a survey tool to fill in those gaps, and then conducted a statewide survey that went out to all licensed attorneys in rural Kansas. And we got a great response rate to that, one that I'm told was statistically significant. Then once we had our survey, we conducted listening tours in Great Bend, Dodge City, and Pittsburgh, Kansas. We did interviews of law students at both of the law schools in our state to understand their perspective and gather additional data. We collaborated with other universities and their support systems to try and refine our data, do some GIS mapping, some of which you'll see here today. And then at each of our meetings, we also brought in program directors from in-state and out-of-state who were already leading initiatives designed to recruit and retain licensed professionals to their rural communities to understand what they were doing that was working, what they tried to do that didn't work as well, and to really try and hone in on what sort of solutions were viable moving forward. That included both speakers within the legal profession and other professions as well, veterinary medicine, and then for physicians as well. Okay, so we get to some of the good stuff, I guess, the meat of this. So what did we learn? What did we find from doing this work? Well, first and foremost, we learned that there's a shortage of attorneys statewide, right? It is already starting to creep into our urban districts, this issue. It just so happens that it is way more pronounced and problematic in our rural areas. And you can see this from the pie chart, from the handout, where we have, based on population, roughly a 45-55 split. 55% of the population lives in those 5 big counties in our state, where 45% live in the remaining 100 counties. And you would like to see our attorney distribution sort of parallel that same population distribution, and that's just not the case. When it comes to attorneys, you see roughly 80% of our attorneys are living and practicing in those big 5 counties, leaving only 20%, which is just about 1,500 attorneys to represent 1.3 million of our citizens. So it's a big disparity. And how does that look then? If you take a look at what does that mean on a county by county level, and I know it's a little bit hard to pull out all the shades of blue, but it means that we've got 47 counties today that already meet the ABA and other professional definitions of a legal desert, which is about 1 attorney per 1,000 residents. We have 2 of our counties that just have no attorneys at all in those areas. Just to give you some perspective, if you look at the national average, that number would look closer to 4 attorneys per 1,000 residents. And so you can see, while even graphically you can tell, 3, 4 of the big 5 counties really are the darkest shaded, meaning they have the most attorneys, but even they are falling behind the national average. Okay, So that sort of told us where we are. It gives us some ways to quantify what the situation looks like today. But we also wanted to look ahead to see what was coming, right? Some people say you never know that, but we were able to identify one concerning trend. Nearly 1/3 of our Kansas attorneys are over the age of 60. So that just means that a significant portion of our attorney population is approaching retirement age or has exceeded that threshold. And our survey data also told us that age differential is more pronounced in rural parts of our state, where median ages of attorneys are closer to 55 rather than 50, or even the median average in the United States of 46. So we've got a lot of attorneys that have passed the ideal age that they wanted to retire and are also rapidly approaching that age. And so graphically, just to see what that might look like as these attorneys aged out, if you remove them from our mapping, you would be looking at 87 of our counties as legal deserts, 9 of our counties having no attorneys at all right? And so you can see where things are headed and demographically, and that's a real problem that we felt emphasizes the need to take action quickly. And I just wanted to illustrate one point when you're looking at the data in our final report and in the PowerPoint slides that have been shared with you today is, if anything, our information slightly understates the significance of the problem. And that's because a lot of this data comes from our registration data, attorney registration data. We're counting the attorneys that are registered as active attorneys, right? That means that includes our judges. Judges aren't representing clients in these communities. It can include single employer attorneys that are only working for one organization, maybe a couple of counties serving as county attorney, and that's their entire or the majority of their caseload. It also includes individuals that have wound down their practice, or at least are not taking new clients, but they're just not ready to change their status of their license to inactive or to retired status, right? So the numbers that you see really sort of overstate it because we're counting attorneys in this data that aren't able to actually represent businesses and individuals in these communities. Okay, so what's it look like on the supply side? What I thought about as I was just starting on to chair this committee is like simple supply side economics, right? There's a high demand, there's limited supply. Let's increase the supply of attorneys. Let's increase our class sizes. But we learned pretty quickly that it's not going to be that easy. And just to give you some background on the law school admissions data in our state, you can see that the number of attorneys admitted in our state sort of has been on a gradual decline and then a small uptick over the pandemic periods. But on balance, it's been on a slow decline since the 1980s, actually. And you can see that at the same time, our law schools have seen a similar decline in applications. Fewer people applying to our law schools, and that's generally consistent with other law schools outside of our state. It almost looks from this chart as though it's sort of declined and hit a new baseline over the last 15 years. And then, not surprisingly, then we see the actual rates of graduates from our law schools looking like they're following a similar trend on that graph, where a slow decline to what looks like a new baseline. What I found to be most surprising, to me at least, is how many of these graduates we lose that are coming out of our law schools. Last year, just to give you an example, 50.3% of Kansas Law School graduates left our state, right? So we think that's an area where maybe we can focus in on. If we could retain a higher percentage of our own graduates to practice in our state, that could be very helpful. But why is this happening? From our law school representatives, what we're hearing is there are several dynamics. One is fewer people are interested in practicing the law. Maybe that's because of the economics of law school, the cost of obtaining that degree, and concern about whether that will pay off over the long term. But for whatever reason, they're not seeing as many qualified applicants. They're not in a position to lower their admission standards just to increase the class size because they have accreditation standards they have to meet, and they have to remain competitive with other universities to keep their enrollments up. Also, what we heard is some of these law schools in our state and outside our state, they've made capital improvements, significant capital improvements, based on the assumption that of a certain class size that will be at a lower threshold, right? So there are physical limitations to what those folks can bring in. Our committee even spent a good deal of time talking about, well, what about a new law school? Or what about a satellite campus, sort of modeled after KU Medicine, Salina campus, right, as an example. But the capital investment would be extremely enormous, and the due diligence to do that work would be equally enormous. So our committee said that's something we should continue to study with the recommendations that we've made to the court. But for the meantime, we were looking at more attainable and immediate solutions. But it's certainly something worth continuing to explore down the road. Okay, before I talk about, why is this happening? What are the barriers to recruiting and retaining attorneys? I always want to talk about, so what, right? Why does this matter? And I think it's important from a policy perspective for several reasons, this issue, the attorney shortage issue. One is economic. Rural attorneys are important to the economic viability of the community. Having those attorneys in these communities is uniquely important. There are sophisticated businesses throughout rural Kansas, whether it's an agricultural, electric, energy companies, oil and gas, you name it. There are complex business operations that need legal representation, right? They need help with acquisitions, with asset purchases, with financing, contracts, enforcing those contracts. And local attorneys have a better understanding of those operations because they live with these business owners, right? They understand the operations inside and out. Beyond that, they understand the regional economy. They understand the local jurors, right? If anybody's going to trial, because they're their neighbors, right? In contrast, if these organizations have to go to Denver, Wichita, Kansas City for counsel, at best, it's going to cost a lot more, right? Because on average, hourly rates are higher in our urban cores, and the travel time alone oftentimes is billed, which increases the cost of that. So these businesses need that representation. These attorneys are also employers. They're running small businesses, so they are part of the employment opportunities that exist in the community, and they frequently invest in other ventures, title companies. Many rural attorneys and firms also acquire title company interests. They invest in car washes. I'm thinking of my own hometown, Sonic Drive-Ins. The Majestic was a fabulous dinner theater and entertainment center in Scott City, run by a local attorney and his wife. They just invest in other areas of the community. Second, why does this matter? These attorneys are also helpful to the community's fabric. If you look at your county hospital boards, the school boards, and other leading organizations in our small towns, you're going to see the local attorneys serving as board members because their skills as attorneys are uniquely suited to that work. Finally, And maybe the one thing that sets the legal profession apart from other licensed professionals is they help us fulfill our constitutional duties. All of us in this room, we've taken that oath to uphold and defend the Constitution of our state and the United States. And as you know, both the United States and our Kansas Constitution guarantees the right to counsel for individuals charged with felony offenses. And that right also includes the right to have counsel appointed for those individuals if they cannot afford that representation, right? So beyond that, the legislature, beyond the criminal context, has identified other areas where the right to counsel also exists in our state. Child in need of care cases, you need representation and appointed representation if you cannot afford it. Juvenile delinquency, civil commitment, habeas corpus, extradition proceedings. The bottom line is, in these rural communities, our judges have to find appointed counsel in many of these cases. And I think this child in need of care genre of cases is really informative, because not only do you need to appoint counsel, but it has to be conflict-free counsel. That means an attorney for, well, a guardian ad litem, an attorney to serve as guardian ad litem, attorney for the mother, a separate attorney for the father in many cases because their interests are not aligned. One of them may have substance abuse issues. One of them may be incarcerated. So they have different interests that need conflict-free counsel. And if the child has views or a position contrary to the guardian ad litem, now the child as well has a right to counsel. So you could be looking at 4 attorneys that need to be appointed in one single child in need of care proceeding. And look, our judges are just having a difficult time finding the coverage for that, right? There's already not enough attorneys in these areas, and not all attorneys that are practicing in rural Kansas are willing to take appointed cases, right? Those that do, their caseloads are extremely high because they're in demand in many districts across the state. So then you get situations that look like this, right? This is just to sort of illustrate what it might look like for an attorney that's willing to take appointments. This is an attorney from the Oakley area that is accepting criminal defense appointments. And in 1 year, this is just what the travel looked like to try and handle those cases. Really traveling all the way to Shawnee County, right? That's an urban county. Again, talking about this issue, certainly more pronounced in our rural counties, but it's coming to our urban areas as well, right? This is an issue that's going to impact everyone in every county in our state. And then all the way down to the Oklahoma border, right? And so the judges handling all these cases, they have to schedule in a way, I mean, this attorney can't be everywhere at once, right? So you have to do scheduling in a way that accommodates all these cases. At best, that slows down our case processing times, right? And then you hear the old adage, justice delayed is justice denied. But at worst, we're approaching a point where we're going to struggle to fulfill our constitutional obligation in these appointed cases. But I just like that GIS mapping tool that kind of illustrated what that looks like, at least from one attorney's perspective. Okay. We've talked about the issue, tried to put some numbers behind it. Why is this happening? Well, our committee was able to identify 3 categories of barriers that seem to be problematic in recruiting and retaining attorneys to these rural communities, all right? We'll talk about each category in a little more detail. The first, there were several financial burdens, barriers to recruiting and retaining attorneys. One stood out as most significant, at least among our law students and recent graduates, and that is education debt. Really what we're talking about here, the bottom line of all this information is that we've got more students borrowing more money than ever before. I mean, that's just the bottom line. Interestingly, our survey data showed us that before 1980, attorneys in rural Kansas, only 26% of them graduated with any student loan debt at all. And the amount of debt was about $12,000, $12,200. I'm told if you adjust that number for inflation, it's around $48,000 in today's dollars. So you've got the exception prior to 1980 was having any student loan debt, and it was, like I said, much lower. Today, those that are graduating after 2011, we've got 93% of our rural attorneys are graduating with student loan debt. Maybe more concerning is the debt load that they are carrying after graduating law school is just about $125,000. So the amounts have increased not only in numbers of people that are in debt, but also the amount of debt that they are carrying. Right, so these students coming out of law school and passing the bar, they've got to service this debt after they've graduated. So if you're in a firm that is offering a lower guaranteed starting salary, or you're offering a compensation package that's based on your production, you're at a competitive disadvantage. And the simple fact of the matter is that in our urban areas, starting law salaries are higher on average than in our rural law firms. Or at least our rural law firms are offering compensation that's more often based on production, right? And that just really puts them at a competitive disadvantage when it comes to recruiting out of the gate. There's also a benefit gap as well. We found that in urban firms, there are robust employer-sponsored benefit packages that are the norm. In our rural law firms, about half of those firms offer a health insurance package. Even fewer are able to offer other benefits like prescription drug, vision, and dental, right? So what happens to those that can't get that health plan through a law firm employer? Well, we found that 33% of those folks are trying to have a spouse, get on their spouse's employee benefit package, or if they're young enough, they're getting on their parents or staying on their parents' plan. But the majority of folks, 62%, are just incurring the cost, right? They're getting their coverage through a private source or on the exchange, right? So that just increased the financial burden of practicing in a rural setting like that. Some go without coverage altogether, which is probably the worst position to be in. There's about 5% of those individuals are not getting any coverage at all. So the financial burden is largely driven by student loan debt and the numbers behind that. But we didn't stop there. We also found that there were several what we called practice barriers to recruiting and retaining these attorneys in rural law firms. And there are several of those, and I'll walk through them. The first, and this is what we heard from law students, well, is this concern about isolation and the lack of mentorship opportunities. There's just a real concern that we're hearing from our law students, at least, that am I going to go out to a rural part of my state and be on an island? Is there going to be anybody there that I can turn to that can help me develop as an attorney, right? Who's going to be my mentor? Who's going to ensure and help me to grow professionally? And you can see that most of the firms in rural Kansas are smaller firms. 1 to 3 attorneys are the average size. And a lot of times your boss, your employer, isn't the ideal mentor, right? A lot of these students felt uncomfortable being honest about what they didn't know how to do, right? They thought that would look bad. So they didn't always want to look to their employer as the source of their mentorship and professional development. And then in smaller communities, well, you could look at other professionals, other attorneys. But so often in our smaller towns, those people are your opposing counsel. So, right, if they're on the other side of a case, it's not really like you can turn to them for mentorship. And really what we found is that there's just really isn't a good structure organization or source that's really focusing on how do we ensure that these young professionals feel supported, they don't feel isolated, and they feel like they can continue to grow as professionals no matter where they're practicing in our state.
Justice Wall, I'm going to interrupt for just a moment, please. I appreciate your very thorough briefing on the work of the committee. We do have Chief Justice here with an update on the Judiciary, so want to save time for that. We are a committee that's going to try to adjourn near noon, so if we could leave time for questions after your presentation and hopefully get to the Chief Justice around 11:30, that would be great.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, excellent. Thank you for the advance notice, and I will plan accordingly. We also learned in terms of the practice side barriers that we don't really have a developed network to help with recruiting and retaining attorneys. The committee discovered that these recruiting networks for rural law firms are at best undeveloped and probably actually non-existent. Students really don't know where to turn to find all of the rural firms and organizations that are looking to hire an attorney. And the law firms, they really don't know where to turn to identify students that are interested in exploring that type of opportunity. And you'll see all of these barriers are really targeted in the recommendations that we'll follow through later. There were also a lot of misperceptions about the availability and type of work available in a rural practice. A lot of the students felt like there wasn't much work available, but that's a myth. Our data shows that our rural attorneys are turning away work every week, right? A profitable business that either it's beyond their area of expertise, that they have a conflict of interest, or they just simply don't have time to handle. So there's plenty of available work available throughout rural Kansas. There's also a lot of practice areas that any attorney can explore and develop. So there's no shortage in terms of what area a newer attorney or somebody coming from an urban firm could develop just because they are in a rural part of our state. We also identified a third category of barrier to recruiting and retention, which we just called cultural barriers. They really include some larger economic issues and then cultural myths. The larger issues are ones that I'm sure you've all heard before because they permeate every profession and employer. You know, am I going to have housing? Am I going to have childcare and health care? These are important issues, and we're happy to collaborate on those, but probably beyond the scope of us handling them directly. There were also what we found is a cultural myth, really a misconception that, especially coming from those that grew up in rural parts of our state, that their definition of success, or in order to succeed, that they needed to move from their hometown and make it in the city, right? To therefore practice in an urban area. And that anyone coming back to a smaller community or their hometown, somehow that was failing or not making it. And so that's helpful because we can combat that stereotype and that myth because it's unfounded. What was more concerning is that myth was reinforced by others, whether law school or other attorney mentors. And so I think we really have to start questioning the source of that information because oftentimes it comes from individuals that never practice in a rural setting and don't have any experience about what it means to practice in that type of environment. Right. That takes us to our recommendations. And obviously I want to leave ample room for time. But so we have 10 recommendations, but I just really want to focus on a few of them in particular. What our committee found and learned is that we can really address this issue and make a dent without reinventing the wheel because the legislature has already found a way to make an impact in other professions. So our first recommendation really is one patterned after the KSU Rural Vet program that I think many of you are familiar with. It's a rural attorney training program where there would be a curriculum that helps these young attorneys get ready for a rural practice that can sharpen their business skills, administrative skills, so that they're going to have more involvement in a rural practice. At the same time, giving them a tuition incentive in exchange for a commitment to practice in rural Kansas, right? And if you look at the numbers from KESU, the Rural Vet Program, they're extremely impressive. You know, the overwhelming majority of these program participants continue to practice large animal veterinary medicine in their original site in rural Kansas or in another rural community, even after their service commitment ends, right? So that's been a very successful model that we think can also work for the attorney profession. The second recommendation really just is designed to hit the student loan issue head on. And it's just modeled after the KU Med rural physician student loan programs. It's a loan repayment incentive in exchange for a commitment to practice in rural Kansas. And again, the KU model that was adopted by the and supported by the legislature has proven to be very successful in both recruitment and retention of physicians to our rural communities across the state. And we think, given the numbers and the information we've shared today, that that could be very important to removing one of the most significant obstacles to recruitment and retention of our attorneys to these areas. And just to summarize, these first two recommendations, the first one really is targeting our law students in that training program during law school. The second recommendation is one that could be available either to students or to practicing attorneys that are ready to make that transition back to a rural community where they grew up or maybe their spouse did as well. I'll just mention one last recommendation because I think it just shows the commitment of our committee, and it's one that's really outpaced the work of our own committee, and that is creating a rural attorney network organization to try and help with recruiting and retention, to try and develop that mentorship. And we had members on our committee that said, we need this, and we're gonna start it right away. And they've done that work, and this program has already started at Washburn University with the help of grant funding from the Patterson Family Foundation. They were able to hire a full-time staff person to begin to develop this attorney network that will really match our law students that are interested in rural opportunities with those rural employers, right? That network just isn't existing right now, and so we think now it can, and that can have some great success. At the same time, they are taking what the Dane Hansen Foundation did in Northwest Kansas and expanding it statewide by offering paid summer externship or internship programs to law students so they can get firsthand experience what it's like to practice in a rural setting anywhere now across our state with the help of that grant funding. The other recommendations, again, target all of the three categories of barriers that we've identified. Some are longer term focused and are targeting folks of all ages in our state. But I'll leave that to you in your free time when you have time to review the report in further detail, because I would like to save time for any questions and then to turn it over to our Chief Justice.
Thank you, Justice Wall. Appreciate the very thorough presentation and the work that the committee has done. So with that, then, we will open it up for any questions from the committee. Do we have any questions? Yes, Senator Rose.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Justice. So we've heard a lot about law students being recruited to go to rural areas. My first question is, what do recent graduates of a Kansas law school have to offer rural attorneys? It seems to me like maybe they could offer some enhanced research techniques, for example, or what if we looked at the issue is, what do the graduates of a law school have to offer the rural attorneys, so they're recruiting?
Yeah, you're asking what do the law schools currently have available for those
The
students?
graduates, what do the graduates have to offer a rural attorney?
Yeah, the graduates would be able to offer their experience, which can go first hand in hand with that mentorship and professional development. The idea behind the K-State Vet, Rural Vet Program and our first recommendation is to make sure that those graduates get enfolded into that program. And as those graduates increase year after year, they become the source of mentorship, maybe even employment opportunities. We think that can really just have an amplifying magnetic force. I think they have a really important role to play. Thank you, Senator.
A follow-up question. I'm of the mindset that the greatest opportunity for a rural attorney is being self-employed. And I appreciate that the recommendation about training on how to be a successful rural attorney. Does that include how to run the business side of a small-town rural law practice?
Yes, thank you, Senator Rose. I think that's absolutely critical for a couple of reasons. One, our law students are telling us they would like to explore that opportunity, but the fear is just too great because they feel they lack those skills and training. And so just like the KSU program, we would like the law school rural attorney program to provide that sort of training, maybe even a capstone or keystone project that would be on the business side focused as well. We think we have to supplement the practical business skills with the legal training as part of that program.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Senator Haley?
Madam Chair, thank you, and thank you, Justice Wall. I'm very concerned about this. Not just we work with the medically underserved communities and had the tuition reimbursement for those that attended our schools. So that was years ago, and it's been marginally successful. So I want to drill down to one of your recommendations, sir, how we could perhaps augment with that the loan forgiveness or the tuition reimbursement if there's pending legislation, or I do appreciate the recommendations. That's my first question. And my second, I tried to Google it. At one point in time, didn't we require by Constitution that every county have a DA? At one point in time, every county, irrespective of population, had to have its own district attorney. Is that still the case? So I know there's a couple of questions there, and if so, how's that being met with the attorney shortage and some of the attorneys that are legally underserved?
Right. I don't know the answer on the statutory basis. There may be a statute requiring a county attorney or prosecutor in every county. That may be the case. I do know there is a statute that requires one judge per county so that access to justice exists statewide, which means that, that's one licensed attorney that's serving in that position, which either takes away from somebody that can practice for the community or leaves one less person to fill in that gap. Oftentimes, it may be a county attorney that's moving on to fill that position too, and it just creates that demand for other attorneys. And in terms of the financial incentive, yeah, we think a student loan incentive, financially, it's the most significant barrier. We've heard our law students say it's the one thing that's stopping them from rural practice. And one step beyond that, during our focus group interviews, that they expressed strong commitment to rural practice if this type of financial incentive, like you have done with physicians, were available to them. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
If I answered both your questions, I
appreciate it. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Senator Titus?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Justice Wall, in some of my experiences visiting with rural and small town firms and solo attorneys, I wonder if it showed up in your data, if there's you mentioned the diversity of work, but if there's a mismatch in the work available to what new students are interested in, because I would hear a lot of, well, we have more divorce cases and family law than we can handle, and we have all of this criminal stuff and appointment stuff, but we need tons of people for that. But I've got just the right amount of oil and gas work and wealthy estate work that I don't really want to hand any of that off yet. And I'm sort of generalizing, but do you hear things like that and see that as a challenge in transitioning?
Yeah, it certainly can be, because you have to find the right match of interest with availability of work for sure. And there is an abundance of family law, criminal, and estate planning work available. But, you know, what we found more than a mismatch was just the misperception of students thinking that none of that work was even available, that there was no profitable work available. And showing them that data, we can re-educate them, because that work is available. And even those that had a good amount of oil and gas or transactional work, a lot of those firms are led by individuals that are ready to hand it on, right? So that opportunity is out there. You know, we've got rural attorneys that handle class action cases that need help, that have handled, you know, high dollar personal injury matters, significant electric co-op transactional matters. I mean, it's just, and they need the help. I've heard that they need the help. So I think it's less about the mismatch and more about our students maybe not understanding the reality of the opportunity that exists. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Klemp.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Justice Wall. More of a curiosity questions, and they're related. Are there specific rural degrees with both of our universities understanding the need for or the shortage in the rural areas? Are there rural degrees? I know we have an ag degree and some other things, being a fan of the veterinary program. I'm just curious, are there degrees specific? And then understanding the recruitment process that the veterinarians go through back into the rural areas, are we recruiting in those areas where family tends to like to go home to family? And are we doing any work in that area as well?
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. As to the second part of that question, I think that's why that rural attorney network, part of that third recommendation, is so important, because I don't think right now we have the law firms that can target those students that maybe are more receptive to the opportunity to go back home. They have those connections. And those students that are open to the idea, like in that position, they don't know who's hiring, because we just don't have that network in place. And so that's really the one thing that's already taken off beyond even just the recommendation stage to implementation. So I think you've identified a really important area that network is hoping to target and hone in on. In terms of the degree programs, I don't know. I'm probably not in the best position to answer that question. I know it's not available in our law schools, and I think that illustrates the need for that rural training program, much like the KSU rural vet program has, that can really, you know, once you've invested in that curriculum, well, that's a commitment to then practicing in those areas. And together with that rural attorney network, I think we could really strengthen the connections between those students that are, you know, that this is an opportunity that really resonates with them, with those employers that need that work.
Can I layer on
Sure.
to that? Thank you, Madam Chair. So to your point, with 53% of the students leaving our state, there might be a subtle reprioritization with how we're selecting students to come into. I'm not looking to lower standards. It's maybe we change how we do that so we can focus on the needs of Kansas.
Yes, and just to clarify, I probably spoke too quickly. It's 50.3%. I probably sounded like 53%. Still too high, right? But I'm scheduling meetings with our law school deans to address that very question. Is there a way that in admissions that we can take some of that into consideration without impacting accreditation standards or the quality levels of our attorneys? But are we getting the folks admitted into our Kansas law schools that are going to be receptive to this incredible opportunity that's available. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Argabright.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Justice. I appreciate the paid internships. I think that is a route that is worth looking into, maybe more depth. And if the programming requires more than one internship with that particular college, then maybe is there talk about requiring one in the rural setting, just as an opportunity? I hate to use the word require, but sometimes you have to force exposure, and sometimes it turns out really well. The other piece, from a professional standpoint, and are we getting into high schools with high school kids that may know what a lawyer is, but doesn't know what they do, and promoting that profession?
Great questions. I think in terms of requiring the paid internship opportunities, certainly as part of the rural training program that we recommend, that would be a requirement. And I think we should entertain all viable options, but I think we've made a great first step with that Patterson at Washburn Law with the Patterson Family Fund coupled with the Dane Hansen grant funding. So now at least we've got a statewide paid internship program that can be available to our law students. And the second question, I apologize, I just lost my train of thought. Your second question was?
Madam Chair, are we promoting the profession with our high school students when we have those opportunities?
Thank you. Yes, we identified in our report that our students are they're forming their idea about what they want to become at a very young age. And yes, we need to increase our outreach through civics education, and that's part of our recommendations. And we've outlined steps that we can take to expand that statewide to high school students and even younger as well, because we think that's an important part of the long-term strategy moving forward. But you've identified it a very important area of the recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Bowers.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And no questions, just comments. I've thoroughly enjoyed serving on this committee, being selected by Chief Justice. It was truly an honor to do this. And being from rural Kansas, 14 counties, 14,000 square miles, I certainly feel and understand this. One thing we did discover is we don't do enough locally. We were discovering with welcoming, inviting, embracing, even like school teachers when they come in each year. So we realize a lot of this burden is on ourselves where we come from. So I do appreciate working with you, and I think we did a really good job with the cross-section of Kansans. I don't think we could have done it any better, Chief.
Thank you, Senator, for all of your work as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I have a question back to the beginning, if we could. I see on the first page of the presentation that the Kansas Rural Justice Initiative Committee was created by administrative order of the Kansas Supreme Court. So it was not a legislatively created committee, but by the Kansas Supreme Court to take a look and study this issue, right?
That is correct, Madam Chair.
And then, so the funding of the committee was funded by what mechanism?
I believe it just came out, what expense that we did incur, which may have been travel reimbursement expenses from our own budget, I believe. Yes, I'm seeing nods. That was my understanding, the judicial budget.
Thank you. And the administrative order was the same day as the establishment of the committee, December 1st, 2022. I'm wondering, was there something that happened just prior to that kind of created the administrative order?
I'll let the Chief Justice answer that, but as we had been discussing that even from, as I recall, from the maybe the state of the state the year before, that we kept hearing these reports, and I think it was just a culmination of time. I don't remember that there was any particular spark. It just sort of coalesced as we continued to get these reports that, hey, it's time we do something, and I was certainly interested in exploring that further, but I'll let the Chief Justice maybe address if there was another particular spark that I wasn't thinking about.
Perfect segue then, so thank you, appreciate that. Thank you very much, Justice Wall, for appearing today and for the thorough presentation and for answering our questions.
Thank you for the time.
Absolutely. Well, thank you then. And next, we will have our judicial branch update. We had the State of the Judiciary address by Madam Chief Justice on Wednesday last week, and it's always kind of the practice of this committee to have further conversation about it with the Chief Justice. So appreciate you coming over today, and please go ahead and reintroduce yourself and welcome to committee.
Thank you. I'm Chief Justice Marla Lukert, and it's my honor to be with you today to be able to answer questions that you may have. I certainly want to use the committee's time to address issues or questions that you have primarily. I will start with the question that's lingering here, and then if you can redirect me, certainly, but I thought, given the number of new members of the committee, I might give just kind of a general overview of the branch, the structure, some of our initiatives that I did not touch on in my presentation to the joint session. So as to the lingering question, really there wasn't a particular spark. It really had been a conversation that had been ongoing for some time. Some of this is not even a conversation that was isolated to Kansas. It's a national conversation, something that almost every state in the country is dealing with, even those that we think of as like New York. As a highly populated, they do have rural areas and they are fighting the same issues. And so there has been this ongoing discussion. It did take a while to put together the committee. It's a large committee. We wanted that diversity of experience and interest and outlook to bring together all of those people, and just putting it together took some time. But that did evolve over that fall, and making those contacts, getting the organization, and the date probably was just coincidence or what happened there. So generally, just as I said, we'll talk just very briefly about our structure. Article 3 of the Kansas Constitution is the judicial article, and it provides that the Supreme Court will administer all courts in Kansas. Those courts range from the municipal level, the county level, our district courts, the Court of Appeals, and the Supreme Court. Through that, we have statutes that, as already been mentioned here today, require a district court in every county, and also require a district judge reside and have that judge's principal office be in every county. The result is that we, of course, start with that baseline of 105, but obviously we have counties that need more judges than that. Currently, counting our appellate courts and our district court levels, this is not including municipal courts. I will not include those in these numbers. We have approximately 290 judges, and we have approximately 1,700 employees. They are stationed actually in 110 court facilities across the country. We have 5 counties that have 2 courthouses, if you will, which our employees break down. You will hear us talk about our court clerks. They are the people who help process the cases. They often are also the people who may be in the courtroom helping the judge with just the moving of the docket while they are in the courtroom. We have court service officers. These officers do a variety of things, including preparing pre-sentence investigations for judges before sentencing, and supervising misdemeanor and low-level felony people who have been sentenced to probation in their community. This may occur sometimes pre-trial and sometimes post-trial, mostly post-trial. Some of those court service officers are also trained to help with child in need of care or domestic cases and doing specific tasks in those areas as well. We have court reporters, and you have heard about our shortage of attorneys. it looks like a surplus compared to where we are with court reporters. We are down to 87 official court reporters in the state, which I'm sure will shock the chair, having come from a background of knowing probably several. It is really a profession that has fewer and fewer people entering it. And as a result, and as I hopefully will mention just a little bit, requiring some innovation and initiatives on our part. Those court reporters, as you're used to seeing them, often sit in the courtroom taking word for word everything that happens in the trial. They create a record that is one of the fundamental requirements of due process in a court proceeding. So it's a very important function. And we are having to look for new ways to deal with that. Another category are those who are in administration, court administration. We have some who work at the statewide level, but we also have, especially in our larger and medium-sized courts, more individuals whose full-time job is really to help administer the court at that level. Now, that makes it sound as if we have what is known as a unified court system, and in large part we do. But it's only kind of, sort of, halfway there. And by that, what I mean is that when the Kansas decided to unify the courts, the state legislature was only willing to take over a portion of the state budget to run those courts. So what the legislature pays for are those personnel costs that I have talked about, primarily. Our personnel, depending upon what budget year you look at or how much you're willing to give us and what we're asking for, make up 90 to 93% of our budget. So the other 7% is running that building across the street, paying mileage for our district judges. We have judges who have 6 counties to cover, and that mileage, as you can imagine, adds up to quite a bit of expense. And paying, in more recent years, we have gone to a unified case management and e-filing system. So that statewide computer network that is now being funded for the software comes from your budget, the cybersecurity increasingly coming from your budget. But at the county level, they are paying all of those operating expenses to turn on the lights, to pay the postage, to bring in the jurors, and do many of those things at the county level. And that includes actually buying the computer hardware that sits in our county court system, which has presented an interesting cybersecurity challenge for us that we have had to deal with. The other thing that I would differentiate about that is that there has been discussion this morning about constitutional and statutory requirements for hiring or providing counsel in sync, juvenile offender, at felony and criminal cases. You have the Board of Indigent Defense Services that the legislature funds that provides those felony. Everything else is being paid for by your county commission at your county level. So those juvenile offender attorneys, even if are paid at the local level, the child in need of care, mental illness, and misdemeanor defense is all being paid for at your county level. So our local judges deal with their local county commissions for a big portion of their budget. I should also mention that the counties pay for the jurors, so any of those fees. So those judges are administering that budget as we are also dealing with the statewide, which is primarily, as I've mentioned, personnel budget. So all of that makes up about 1% of the state general fund. You are funding a core function of government, a third branch of government, at a budget that's on less than 1% of your entire state general fund budget. So I would argue it's quite a bargain when you know what we are providing through that. So just a little, when I have appeared before, we have talked a little bit about case trends. We are what we have seen, to give everybody a little bit broader perspective, is that with COVID, we saw a huge drop-off in case filings, not just in Kansas, but nationally, actually globally. Our numbers in 2010, for example, were like right at 500,000 cases in Kansas. I mentioned in my speech the other day, last year was 330,000. So a significant drop in that level, but that's not the lowest. Actually, 2021 and 22 dropped to the lowest levels, and we have seen a steady increase since that time. So the expectation is that that increase will continue. Whether or not we'll ever get back to the 400,000, which was what it was just before the pandemic, or even in the late 19, or what you will see when I mention that 500,000, what we see if we look historically at case trends is the worse the economy is, the higher the case filings, which is largely accounted for in debt, large processing of foreclosures, credit card debt, all types of debt kinds of situations. And so that was when we had that large uptick just before the turn of the century, when we had financial situations that were not great for everyday Kansans and were resulting in the system. About 10 years ago, we began the process of centralizing our electronic network. We have finished that process. It was slowed down because of COVID. It was slowed down because of the cybersecurity attack. But in this last year, we brought on our last district court in the fall, in November. Johnson County came on as our 105th county to join this centralized system. This last summer, our appellate courts came on the same integrated case management system. Before that, we had operated on a separate system. So we now have a system where you can sit in at your kitchen table and you can sign on and check on cases across the state. The part of the reason the legislature was interested in doing this was to increase that transparency, also to bring about some standardization and some accountability. And all of those things are now present. That accountability is in part due to the fact that we have also centralized our payment system. So we now have, instead of having this done in every of those 105 counties where they were doing their own accounting, it is now done on a larger centralized level, which has brought us the ability to bring in better accounting practices. We have, unfortunately, had a few situations where we have had people who have, employees of the system who have found ways to, that eventually led them to being in prison. We'll just put it that way. But with the accounting controls that are now in place, we think we are going to be able to, we are certainly have better accounting principles in place, better accounting controls in place, and with the positions that you have just given us in the last fiscal year, an audit team that is now on board to help audit each of those levels. Before, you had given those audit responsibilities to each of the counties, and we found that even in our largest counties, their definition of an audit of our court monies was very different than what I think yours would be, and they certainly were different than what mine were, which allowed for some of that malfeasance and misfeasance to occur. Hopefully, we have that accountability in place now, and we feel very good and very comfortable about all of that. We have continued our outreach efforts. Both the appellate courts do, the Supreme Court primarily sits across the street. We will be sitting here tomorrow night, and one in a rare opportunity for you. We hope all of you and your colleagues are able to step in for that. But we do twice a year go out to different parts of the state. When we do that, to speak to our outreach to high school students, the justices fan out and reach high schools. We estimate most of those trips we hit close to 1,000 students, 1,300 at times, more. If we're in a more rural area, it might be a smaller number. This last year, we were in Lansing and Lewisburg for our dockets. In a few weeks, we will be in Logan at the Logan Life Center, which is an integrated high school care facility, all kinds, a community center, all types of things. And they are helping us to actually bus students in from the neighboring communities. So it's a little different format than what we usually do it at night, so that people can come in and listen without having to take off work, and at least if they have a normal work schedule. This time, and then we do the schools during the daytime. We're flipping that. And we will be doing all schools. We'll be attending the oral argument. And then we will be going out to the communities to do outreach in the communities. So a little bit different experience. The Court of Appeals travels all over the state. Last year they were in Kansas City, Hays, Osage City, Colby, Oakley, Lawrence. So I do want to mention one large initiative that I didn't speak to in my State of the Judiciary, and that is that we have received a $683,000 grant from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. This grant will be over a 3-year period, and our focus with this grant is to help us enhance our framework for adult and conservatorship programs throughout Kansas. This is another area where we feel like there needs to be more accountability and more checking of the processes and the things that are going on, with more oversight of those guardianship and conservatorship programs. This will allow us to work with the Kansas Department of Children and Families Adult Protective Service Division, as well as the Kansas Guardianship Program, to help with education, recruitment, and that just oversight of those programs. So we are excited about that. We think it's something that needs to be done. And so we look forward to giving you some more information about the results of that. Those of you who have been here for a few years know that about 3 years ago, we did a statewide mental health summit. We invited the other branches of government to join with us. That summit has resulted in ongoing work by we have 2 legislators that are in the ongoing state committee, as well as representatives from several of the executive agencies. That group is going to be sponsoring its second mental health summit in August, on August 26th and 27th. It will be at Fort Hays State University. So we are hoping that that will make it easy for our rural communities to engage and help with it. Much like our Child Welfare Summit that was held this last year, what we do in each of these situations is have local teams, multidisciplinary teams, in this case, mental health providers and therapists from communities, as well as not-for-profits that are involved in justice-involved mental health issues, the judges, attorneys, advocates, and coming together. They work then to look at their local needs and map out where are we meeting the needs, where are we not meeting needs, and how can we address those places where we have gaps. We have successfully done this, and many communities have had very active and proactive local efforts that have made incredible differences in their communities. So anyway, just to give you an overview real quickly about what you will be seeing, we have continued our work on our cybersecurity recovery. We will be asking for budget money to continue with that process. We are also asking for the access to justice that I mentioned to you, an e-filing system, for self-represented litigants, as well as improving some of our programs. And then the other thing I would mention real quickly is I mentioned that lack of court reporters. So we are having to replace court reporters with e-filing system, with electronic recording systems. And so we're asking for funds for that. So sounds like you need to.
No, sorry, Chief. The noise coming out from the hallway, I was wondering if someone could catch the door and get the
Okay.
doors closed so we could
Okay.
hear the conversation better. Thank you.
So anyway, that
Thank you, Ms.
highlights
Nelson.
just a few highlights of our budget process. And I will, if there are questions about any area I didn't touch on or anything I did touch on, please let me know.
Thank you, Chief. Appreciate that. Committee, are there any questions? Senator Bowser.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Chief Justice. I just first want to make a comment pertaining to the Rural Justice Initiative. As Justice Wall mentioned, my wife and I had an opportunity to adopt a little girl out of the foster care system, and there were 4 different attorneys involved in that from 3 different counties. I just want to applaud you on that. It worked great. The attorneys were wonderful. That was she's been a blessing to our family, and I just want to applaud the Rural Justice Initiative. It is working, and so thank you for that. Chief Justice, a question for you, and you touched on the cyber incident, and I know some funding was appropriated for, monies were appropriated to increase your cybersecurity posture. At just a high level, can you tell us kind of where you're at? Have you fully recovered? Do you feel like you've increased your cybersecurity posture? Is there work still left to do? Thank you.
Certainly. One thing that I have learned through this process is this is a never-ending search for safety in this area. As I have just said that sentence, there are people who are out there inventing new ways to attack us. It evolves so rapidly that it is incredible what it takes to just keep up with the current things. The things we worried about when this attack hit are just kind of like on the shelf now. The use of AI is changing the threat enormously. But yes, we feel like we are in a place that we are able to stay up and at least try to do all we can to prevent. We have re-engineered our system so that we feel like if we were to be hit again, we could recover more quickly than we did before. Certainly, we learned a lot through that process, and we have been trying to share that with the executive branch, the legislative IT people. They've been wonderful and supportive with us, but also with partners across the country. But it is, in that process, we have had 2 personnel changes. We now have our cybersecurity manager in place, and we also had a retirement and turnover in our IT position. And so as both of those people came on, many of you know Alex Wong. He has worked with the legislature from the executive branch side for many years. They have reevaluated a few things, and so yes, we do still have some requests that we are making that both of them have asked for. So we do hope we get that support. It's something that none of us can ignore. We've learned the lesson the hard way. It is something where we have to put our resources.
Thank you. Senator Klemp.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Chief Justice. You had mentioned briefly, before we close the doors, something about the desert and recorders. Did I say that right? The positions where there's a lack of people filling those roles. And it sounds like you're inviting in the conversation of automated recording utilizing AI as a portion of that. Is there or funded positions for those positions that would be available to pay for that? It's my learning here, so bear with me, to be able to pay for that solution, because it does seem like that would be a good solution in lieu of having folks that could fill those roles? And is that a centralized solution versus in each of the districts?
Yes, yes to all of the above, I think is the way. So as we have had unfilled court reporter positions, there are some that we hold them open for a while on the hope and the prayer, and occasionally somebody comes along and we can fill one of those positions. But we do rotate them through and we repurpose them, and what we have repurposed them to are transcriptionists. And so many of our district courts have, again, the tape recording systems are primarily paid for by the counties. And so many of our counties have gone to that. And then these transcriptionists are actually taking that recording and making the transcript. And so we have been filling that need in that way. What we have now, we've also recently done a centralized court reporter. I mean, like in the last few weeks, we have done a centralized court reporter position because we do have an employee of the court already who is willing to travel, because those court reporters are uniquely able to help in a jury trial situation with the things that the judge and the jury need immediately sometimes. And they also are better at what happens in a courtroom. You have a judge who may have to be checking to make sure the recording is going, plus ruling on the motions and dealing with the people coming in and out of the courtroom. Sometimes those recordings don't get turned on. And so we have had those kinds of issues, as well as other gaps that do develop. So the judges have been asking for more positions in the courtroom so they don't have to do that part of it. So we have also been repurposing some positions. Of course, one court reporter is paid more than some of those people, but we can spread that salary money out to help the judges with the handling of that. But what we also are looking at with our budget request this year is that the demand for digital evidence is increasing rapidly, and the courts need a way to deal with that. And we need the attorneys and the judges are asking for a uniform way to do it, so that Judge A has a 6-county area that he or she covers. She doesn't have to learn a different system in County A, a different one in B, a third one in C, and on down the line. That we have, and the same for the attorneys that are appearing in different courtrooms, that it will be a uniform system. So that is also part of what we're asking for.
Thank you. And question from Senator Rose.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Chief Justice. Regarding the shortage of bids attorneys, we're paying staff attorneys approximately $30 an hour, and private attorneys about $140 an hour. And from your perspective, do more experienced, maybe talented attorneys who command a higher hourly rate than the $140 an hour, do they result in a more efficient court case process that ultimately might save taxpayers money while delivering a more accurate justice for the alleged? So do you have a thought on what the optimum hourly rate is for attorneys, private attorneys in the BIDS program?
I don't. I'm sorry, that's not an area that I have focused on to give you a dollar amount for that. I can give you an example, though, of the efficiency that can be gained by having that stability. And this came in Sedgwick County as part of their COVID recovery from their backlog. They took ARPA money, well, I shouldn't say that. They took grant money, I believe it might have been ARPA money, and that the county had. And the county hired, there was actually a small law firm of criminal defense attorneys who offered to do this. And they came to the county. They basically became a hired capture, if you will, for low-level felony, mostly property crime type of cases. And they agreed to take that entire docket for anybody who would want a court-appointed attorney. The court gave them an office in the courthouse, they also set up a streamlined docketing system for that. If we had more time, I would go into a lot of details because it's really a very fascinating story. But anyway, they dealt with thousands and thousands of backlog cases quickly. Where they needed to have trials, they had trials. Where people could, a lot of times in those situations, everyone's goal is to make sure that there's restitution to the crime victim. That was their principal goal, is probation with the restitution payment. But with the efficiency of having that basically a law firm sort kind of situation paid for by the government to handle those cases, the efficiency improved dramatically. We might still be struggling our way through that backlog had it not been for that kind of a system and that innovation.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. And Chief, you didn't get much of an opportunity to talk about our specialty courts here in Kansas, but I did want to make a comment about those. We do have 31 judicial districts in Kansas, and we do have specialty courts in 16 of them, I think. So want to thank the efforts of our judiciary for getting those specialty courts established. They're veteran treatment courts. I think we have mental health specialty courts, drug treatment courts, as well as family law specialty courts. And I think if you could just comment just briefly on how those have helped with processing cases, with serving justice, and also helping those in the justice system from help them finding solutions, and just speak just briefly about that for those who are new to the committee and those of us who would like an update.
Sure. I know some of you have had the opportunity to attend a specialty court. I really encourage those of you who haven't yet to do that, if it's made available to you at your local level, or the Shawnee County Court, I'm sure is always welcome, would always welcome you. We do have courts in about half of our districts, about half of our counties now, as we're getting closer and closer to that number. Not quite. We will be adding 2 specialty courts in the upcoming months. The 7th district in Lawrence is adding a veterans treatment court. That will give us veterans treatment courts in several locations. And then behavioral health treatment court will start in Salina. Some of our districts have multiple specialty courts, but we do have some without any. The idea there is a very intensive program. A lot of people that are invited in or are qualified for the program will say, no, I want to take just plain probation, it's a lot easier. But the people who commit to this program and graduate, the national data is that 2/3 of those individuals do not reoffend. That is significantly more, like at least 25 to 30% more, in some cases even a higher percentage than that, of improvement on that statistic. And so that alone, I think, tells us that that investment is worth it. Those are primarily been paid for through grants. We've had amazing support from Senator Moran, who has been able to get line item appropriations for our veterans treatment courts, for several of them anyway. But all of that grant funding is not stable. It's kind of, some have had it for a long time, but others have it for a year and then they lose it and then they have to scramble. So we are at the committee that the chair sits on has suggested that we ask you as a legislature for $3 million to stabilize that funding for those programs. I can't imagine a better investment that the legislature could make in the criminal justice system.
Well, thank you, Chief, and that does bring us to, after the noon hour, and want to thank you for your very informative presentation today and for visiting from across the street. And we are hosting, I guess, here in this room anyway, the Supreme Court is hearing arguments tomorrow night at 5:30, and the legislature has been invited to observe that. And so they'll be sitting behind me, right, in these seats, just like they used to when the Kansas Supreme Court operated here 100% of the time before the building across the street was opened in 1973. Do I have that right? Yes. Okay. Well, great. So it's just like old times, right? Well, with that then, committee, our business is concluded for today, and we are adjourned. Thank you.